Now, with our first steps taken and with some core basics out of the way which we need in any JavaScript program, before we dive deeper into more basic features and more syntax and language features you need to know, let's have a look at debugging your code and at ensuring that you're able to efficiently work on your code, that you're efficiently developing. Because that is important. When you're writing code, you will encounter errors. And therefore, in this module, we'll have a look at how you find errors, how you fix them, which different tools you have, and which different kinds of errors you might be encountering. Now, in addition to that, it's of course also important that even if you're not facing errors, you're productive. And that means that you leverage the IDE or the editor you're working with, and that you're getting a lot out of it, that you're feeling comfortable writing code with the tools you're working with, and that overall you have a smooth workflow and you're able to progress and to write good code. And that also includes, and that's the last thing we'll also have a look at in this module, it also includes that you're able to find help and to know resources where you can dive deeper, where you can learn more. So these will be the blocks we'll have a look at in this module. I already outlined it in the introduction video. There are effectively 3 parts that we'll have a look at in this course module. The first part I want to have a look at is how you can write code efficiently. And with that, I don't necessarily mean that you can write code as quickly as possible, but I mean that you're able to really get a lot out of the tools you're working with, that you know how to write code without too much copy and pasting or manual work. Now, the next block we'll then have a look at is how you can find help. Because in programming, even if you took many courses, even if you've been a developer for many years, you'll always encounter scenarios or use cases where you're not sure how to solve something, or where you know there was a feature in JavaScript, some built-in function that allows me to do that, but I can't remember that function. I don't recall how it worked in detail. And that's totally normal. When becoming a developer, the goal is not to learn all features and all the commands by heart. That will be impossible, not only because there are a lot of commands to learn, but also because programming languages evolve and new features are being added. So don't take this course or any other resource as a I have to learn it by heart resource. Rather, learn how a language generally works and how you have to think about writing code, and then also know where to find help and where to dive deeper if you need a specific feature or a specific command. And that's also something I'll explore with you in this module. And the last block is that you need to be able to debug your code. You will encounter errors, and therefore it is important for you to be able to find and fix these errors. So if we talk about writing code efficiently, what exactly does that mean? It means that you should work in a productive environment. And with that, I'm talking about the environment on your machine, not the environment you're working in. Of course, that should also be productive, but that's something you'll have to figure out, where you work, in which office, and you might also not be able to control this if you, for example, are employed. So I'm talking about the IDE, the editor, and about configuring it such that you like working with it. That also includes that you use the editor or the IDE to its fullest potential, that you're able to auto-format your code so that you don't manually have to indent things and so on, that you use important shortcuts. It also, of course, means that you take advantage of the auto-completion and the hints many editors and IDEs give you. Visual Studio Code, the IDE I recommend for this course, certainly does so. And of course, it also means that you keep your eyes open for editor extensions and for the settings you can tweak there to really adjust everything in the way you like to have it. So let's have a look at that, and let's explore some of the things I would recommend that you look into and that you get started with. Here is the app we've been working on in the last course module, opened in Visual Studio Code. Now that's the editor, the IDE, we've been using throughout this course, and I showed how to set it up and how to basically configure it in the first course module. So definitely make sure you watch that. Well, I guess otherwise the last module was a bit hard to follow along anyways. Now, this editor is configured to suit my needs, and I recommended some basic configuration which I like because I don't think I have that much of a special taste. Still, make sure you tweak this to your likings. And that starts with the look. In Visual Studio Code, and of course in most or in all editors and IDEs, you will find similar settings. You are able to adjust its appearance. In Visual Studio Code, you do that under Code, Preferences, and then, for example, here, the color theme. The color theme is the core thing that influences how the editor looks like. And a lot of people prefer the dark look I have here, in my case with the Dark Plus default dark theme. But you can also go for a light theme if you're a fan of this, or choose one of the many other installed themes you find there. You can also install additional themes with the help of the extensions section, which I'll dive into in a second. So the theme here is the first thing with which it all starts. Now, besides the general theme, you can also set a file icon theme here in Visual Studio Code. And there I installed the material icon theme with you in course module 1. You can of course also go with one of the built-in themes or install any other theme you want, either with this shortcut here, but this will also just lead you to the extensions marketplace if you want to call it like this, and we'll have a look at that in a second. So the look, of course, should really suit your needs. It's also not just the theme and the icons. Also make sure that here in the view section, you configure the appearance the way you want it to look. That you show the sidebar or the status bar, maybe show one of the other things you can show here, like that activity panel here, which I personally don't like to have, which is why I remove it here. So really play around with these settings and find a layout that you like, that works for you, that allows you to be productive. Now, of course, the look and feel of your editor and your IDE is one thing, but it doesn't stop there. Once you start writing code, there are also other things that really matter. For example, that you are aware of some key shortcuts. Now again, here in Visual Studio Code, you can find many shortcuts by just going into the different sections here that allow you to edit your code, and there you always find the shortcut that would allow you to do the same thing. These are simple things like undoing or redoing, which you'll use a lot, or copy and pasting, which you probably know. But then we also got things like here, toggling the comments, which I did already in an earlier module, which allows you to quickly comment a line in or out. And the shortcuts you're seeing here might not be the same ones I have here, because you can rebind these shortcuts, and I'll come back to that in a second. Also important are the selection shortcuts you find here, or the selection modes you find here. This allows you to quickly select similar values, for example, with the Add Next Occurrence shortcut if you want. There I could mark log entries, and if I now hit the shortcut for this, or I choose the option here of course, but using the shortcut is simply faster. So if I do this, then it selects the next occurrence of this same word, if you will, in my code. So now I have this selected and this selected. And that's great for renaming, for example. If I want to rename this, I can just hit the shortcut until I have all occurrences selected. I also get a hint here on the right in the scroll bar where all these occurrences are. And then I can give this a new name, and now it's renamed in all the places where I did use it. So that allows you to change and refactor things much faster. And this is also a crucial shortcut. And all these selection shortcuts can be really helpful. For example, for moving something up a line or down a line. That makes restructuring your code, which you will ultimately do a lot in development, way easier. Now, not all shortcuts might work for you. Maybe you want to change one, and you can do that under Code, Preferences, and then there Keyboard Shortcuts. If you click on that, you find all the shortcuts which are built in, and there are a lot of shortcuts. But the good thing is, it's really great to search this. For example, if you're not happy with that Add Next Occurrence shortcut here, and you want to use a different one, well, you can type Add Next, and it's actually this one here. You can also search for a key binding. If you can't find the shortcut otherwise, you can search for this here on Mac by just typing Command D. And now it shows you all shortcuts that include the command key and the D key. Of course, also the control or the shift key is supported. Same for space and so on. So you can also search for keys and find the actions that are bound to these keys. So that gives you a lot of power to really find all the different commands you might need. And then, of course, it's needless to say that you can change them by just right-clicking on this and then change key binding. So really make sure that you adjust these shortcuts to your requirements and that you simply have a look at the menu up there, the menus up here, to find some actions that might look useful to you and bind these to shortcuts which you can reach. And as you work and as you grow as a developer, you'll find more and more shortcuts you work with. So the goal is not to stop developing for 2 days now and just explore all possible shortcuts. You can do that if you like, but my recommendation would be that you just have a brief look at the options you find here in the menu and experiment with these options. And then as you continue with development and as you write code, you will automatically reach situations where you think, that would be really nice if I could fix it with a shortcut. And then you can go to this shortcut changing menu, to the keyboard shortcuts menu here, and simply search for the action you want to do and see which shortcut this has. And if it doesn't have a shortcut yet, you can assign one. So using shortcuts, really something which I would recommend. Now, all the shortcuts don't help you if you write bad or incorrect code. But here again, modern IDEs or editors like Visual Studio Code have you covered. You get a lot of auto-completion here. Let's say here, with our create and write output method. If I want to use this method, let's say I would want to call it here, I can type create and write, or just create in my case, and I get suggestions. I get suggestions of functions or variables that I could use here that basically include the word create. And they don't just have to start with it, they include it anywhere. It doesn't even have to be one word, as you can see with the suggestions down there. All properties or functions that include the characters I just typed in the right order will be shown here. And then the suggestions are narrowed down the more I type. So that's really useful because that allows you to write code quicker. For example, here I can just type create. The IDE intelligently guesses that I probably mean create and write output. Otherwise, I could select a different option. And then all you have to do is tap enter or tab to use that and to complete that word, which of course saves you the hassle of writing it all on your own. So that's much faster. Now, in addition, you also find a short description of what you're going to use here on the right. Here, for example, you see that this is a function, that is the name, and that this function will take a couple of arguments, which of course allows you to find out if that is the function you really want to use here. Some functions and properties, especially the built-in ones, even have short descriptions attached to them, which you then also find here in the panel on the right to learn more about it and learn more about what this will do for you. So this is very important and really helpful. You also get something similar if you, for example, add a dot after an object, or in this case here after an array, which turns out to be an object. If you add a dot here, you get this auto-completion that offers you a list of all the properties or functions you can access on this object, like the push function here, which allows us to add a new entry. Then you get a short description of it here on the right. You see the arguments it takes. The syntax might not fully be clear at this point, but that's not a problem. We'll dive more into arrays later. And you see that an array, for example, has way more methods or way more functions attached to it. And I'll dive into way more of them in a separate module focused on arrays. So this dot notation also comes with great auto-completion. And by the way, if this menu ever closes or you accidentally close it, if you want to bring it back, of course you can delete the dot and add another one. But you can also just use a shortcut, which by default should be Control Space, and this will bring up this suggestions menu again. So this is another core feature which I would recommend that you use. You can also hover over things and you'll get a short description of what this is and what this does. For example, that push is a function. It's called method here, and I'll come back to what the difference is, but it's essentially a function, and you see what it does. So this is also helpful. You can hover over things to learn a bit more about it. And when you call a function, like let's say, create and write output, and you enter the parentheses, you by default get this parameter help here, where you see all parameters, and the value which you now need to provide for the first parameter is even highlighted here, so that you know that whatever you're going to type now will be received on this operator parameter. And once you enter this and you add a comma, you see that now the next parameter is highlighted. Now that's really convenient. If you ever close this menu for some reason, you also get a shortcut for this. So let's quickly check this and maybe just type parameter here. What we see is we got this trigger parameter hint shortcut, which is this combination, Shift Command Space in my case. So if I now type Shift Command Space here, you see this menu reopens. So that's also really convenient. So these are the core features you should be aware of and you should experiment with and you should leverage, because that helps you write correct code faster and without errors. And that's always something you want to do, of course. Now, last but not least, many modern IDEs and editors allow you to install extensions. Here in Visual Studio Code, you reach that extensions section by going to View and then Extensions. The default view which we're currently in is the Explorer, by the way. Now, if we go to Extensions, what we see here is a list of enabled extensions I got installed. Got a couple of Angular extensions here because I work with Angular, and then a special theme which I installed, Dart, because I did some Flutter and Dart development, and a couple of other extensions as well. Now, you can, of course, always search for extensions by typing up here or by scrolling through the recommended ones. And, for example, what you could do here is you could search for Prettier. It's one extension which we got installed already. We installed that in Module 1. Prettier is an extension that helps you with auto-formatting. And in my case, as I said, I already have it installed. But if you don't have it installed yet, you can install it from here. Now, you can always learn more about extension on this page. You'll learn how it works, how to use it, how to configure it, which settings you can adjust. And this, therefore, allows you to tweak the development experience to your requirements and maybe even add brand new features to your development environment. So definitely also utilize this. My recommendation just would be that you don't install too many extensions, because it's easy to add more and more and more extensions. And at some point of time, your editor might become slow because of all these extensions, or you get strange behaviors, maybe strange auto-formatting, which you didn't expect because you got multiple extensions clashing with each other, or extension A changing some configuration of extension B. So don't overdo it, but of course have a look at potential extensions that might help you. With that, let me go back to the Explorer. Now, as I mentioned, extensions can be installed and also can be configured. And in general, dive into your settings. Here in Visual Studio Code, you do this with Code Preferences Settings. There's a lot you can configure. For example, if I search for tab width here, I can configure how much white space is entered when I hit the tab key. Here you see what Prettier, the extension I installed, will use for indentation, and that are 2 blanks, which I want to use in this course. But you see that, for example, my editor by default would use 4. So I'll change this to 2 here as well. And if you do that, you can always choose whether you want to save this for your user, which means that will be the setting in all projects you open with Visual Studio Code, or in your workspace, which would only be this project. If you choose workspace, so if I change this here, and you save that, that will actually be written to this settings.json file, which you find in the .vscode folder, which is then automatically created. There you find your project exclusive settings, whereas your general settings, which you set up for the entire user, are not stored in this project, but unsurprisingly are stored in a global place on your machine, so that Visual Studio Code uses them no matter which project you're working in. Now, here you also got a bunch of settings. There are so many settings you can scroll through to configure the text editor exactly to your requirements, to change the font you use there, the font size, the way it looks, the way it behaves. There's so much you can do here. Now, attached you find some resources that help you dive deeper into Visual Studio Code if you're using that. And in general, feel free to just browse through that. Normally, the default should be pretty good, but if there is something you want to change, something you detect which you would like to behave or look differently, then there's a good chance that you can change it here in the settings. Under extensions, you also can change the settings of the extensions you installed, for example, of Prettier. So if you got an extension and it doesn't behave the way you want it to behave, maybe you can adjust that in the settings here as well. So also explore that. Now, last but not least, in Visual Studio Code, under View, you also got these different modes here. I showed you the Extensions view, which allows you to browse extensions. Explorer is that view you see here, which is the view you typically work in the most. It allows you to see your files here on the left. Search can also be very helpful, though. Search allows you to search through all your files, and you can change how it searches. For example, if it searches in a case-sensitive way here. And there I could search for write to log, and if I do that, it shows me that it found this write to log thing in 5 places, all in app.js, and if I click on there, it highlights it here. It also highlights all the results here in the scroll bar on the right. So this can also be very helpful. Now, under View, you also have the SCM view. Now, that helps you with source control. So when you're using Git, then you see what you changed since your last commit, and you can inspect what you changed here and commit that and so on. So if you want to have a graphical user interface for source control, you can use this. And Debug is a mode I'll come back to later in this module once we dive into debugging our code. This can be really helpful with understanding our code, how it executes, and can help us find and fix errors. So that's Visual Studio Code and working with the IDE, and I hope it gave you a general idea of what you can configure there, what you might want to think about, and what you might want to explore to work with your code effectively. So you're able to work with the IDE in an efficient way. Now you also need to understand where to find help, where to dive deeper in cases where the IDE doesn't provide sufficient support. And there we got one amazing resource for web development in general, but also specifically for JavaScript. And that's MDN. I'll come back to MDN in a second. It's a web page. It's like the official JavaScript documentation, if there were one. There you find everything about JavaScript. It's extremely detailed. You find information about basically every built-in function and object and thing you can do. And it's an amazing reference. Can be overwhelming if you first dive into it, but I'll show you how to work with it in this module. Now, in addition, you need to learn how to Google. Seriously. It's astonishing to see how many developers are not able to Google. Often in development, you don't know the solution yet, or you just know, I want to do this. Maybe I can do it like that, but I'm not sure. And then why don't you just Google it? But of course, you need to know how to Google, and I'll show you in this module, to find discussions where other people discussed the same issue, and where you then maybe find some ideas on how to think about the problem or how to solve it. Also, learn how to ask proper questions, no matter if you're doing that here in the Q&A section or in public forums like Stack Overflow, which is a great developer forum. There you can ask for help, but you need to ask in a way that allows others to help, which means you need to describe your problem. If you're getting an error, you need to copy and paste in the error message. You really need to ask proper questions to get proper responses. And also, help others. Don't just ask. Also help others. Be friendly. Dive into the community, because that will allow you to grow as a developer. And last but not least, no matter how seasoned you are as a developer, you will always have a lot of trial and error. Sometimes you know how you want to solve something. You know that it should work the way you're writing your code, but it just doesn't work. Well, don't give up then. Just keep on trying. Tweak your code. Google, come back, change something, and find a fix, find a solution. Of course, here I'm not talking about syntax errors, simple errors, where you misspelled something, but where you just can't get the logic right for something, where you want to calculate a random number between 1 and 10, and you always get one between 0 and 1, let's say. Well, this is all about trial and error, tweaking your code, trying out if it works, and that is also an important part of development. So let's dive a bit deeper into all of this, and let's start with MDN. You can just Google for MDN, and here we're already getting started with the Googling, and you should find the MDN web docs. Now, in case you're wondering, MDN stands for Mozilla Developer Network, but this site evolved over time, and now it's not just a site maintained by Mozilla, but instead a lot of developers are working on it to make it the kind of pseudo-official web development reference and guide collection. Now, on this page here, you can dive into different technologies, for example, JavaScript. And there you'll also find a couple of tutorials, which I really can only recommend that you also dive into. They won't replace this course here because these are all written tutorials, so you find no video tutorials in there. It's more about reading here, and it can be overwhelming if you're brand new, in my experience. But it's a great additional resource also to go through at the same time whilst you're going through this course or after going through this course. So this is really amazing. There you can learn a lot about JavaScript, its core features, its core functions that are built in, all the syntax, and so on. And then you also got the references and the guides. And there you also find more tutorials, but for example, under references, you find detailed references for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And if we explore the JavaScript one here by clicking on reference, what we actually can find there are complete references of all built-in objects. And you see there are a lot, no worries. We'll learn about all the important ones throughout this course. You can find more about expressions and operators which are built in, all about functions, how to write them, how to configure them, and so on. So you really find a lot of stuff in there which will help you work with JavaScript and write good code. So this is a great resource to come back to. And often it's easiest to work with it by not just searching on their site, but let's say you want to learn more about the parseInt method. Well, you can always search for MDN and then the thing you want to learn more about. For example, parseInt. And if you do that, you should find the parseInt article on MDN, as I do here. And there you see a short snippet for it, a short description. You can even run that short snippet. You then find the detailed syntax description below, the arguments, the parameters this takes, and what needs to be passed in there. You find a more detailed description, more examples. So that's really, really amazing. And by the way, if you dive into this right now, it can be overwhelming because there you also see some features covered which we haven't covered yet in this course. But still, to look things up, especially if you're a bit further into JavaScript development, that can be really helpful. And that's what I meant with don't learn it by heart. It's all written down there. You just need to remember that there was some parseInt function and you can search for it and find it here. Now, what if you don't remember the exact name of something and you still want to learn more about it? Well, let's say we don't know that it's called parseInt. Then, Googling this correctly would be that you type JavaScript to kind of narrow down what you're interested in this case, the JavaScript language, and then convert string to number. And if we do that, then here automatically even Google gives us a hint that parseInt probably is helpful. But we also find more. If we scroll down, here we got parseInt already. We also will find something on Stack Overflow, which is the kind of official development forum where you find a lot of discussions. You can also ask questions on your own here, but many problems have already been solved and can be found here. And therefore you can find solutions here by just Googling correctly. Here you find one suggestion with this number thing, which we haven't seen. But then here you also find parseInt again. Or this plus operator, which I already showed you in this course as well. So that's really helpful, and this is what I mean with Googling correctly. First, put JavaScript, so that Google only shows you results that are kind of related to that. And then try to describe the problem you're having with only a couple of keywords. Don't write sentences here which you would speak to another human, but instead use keywords, important keywords that narrow down your issue. And this normally helps you find discussions where that problem has been discussed or give you a link to MDN or comparable sites right away. So this is also how you should think about solving problems here and about finding help. So you know how to write your code and how to dive into external resources and find support. Now you're writing code and you're having errors in there, and that will happen. That doesn't make you a bad developer. That's just totally normal. You will always also encounter errors when writing code. Now we need to learn how to find and fix them, and that there also are different kinds of errors. So when we think about debugging our code, there are different kinds of errors you can get. You got errors which basically show you some error message where your app may be crashed, where it doesn't work at all. And you got logical errors. Logical errors don't make your app crash. They also don't result in an error message, but your app behaves incorrectly. Now I will show you both kinds of errors in this module and show you how to find and fix both. Now, if you're getting an error message, read and utilize it seriously. So many people see an error message and they just go into panic mode and that's it. So many people don't even bother reading error messages, even though many error messages are quite clear regarding what's wrong. So by just reading it and diving into the line of code, which typically is included there, you can fix many errors. If you got an error message which you don't understand, you can Google it, because guess what? You're probably not the first person who got an error message. So put it into Google and you'll find many solutions there. But sometimes that alone doesn't do the trick. Sometimes you need to look into your code whilst it's executing to get a feeling for how values of variables change over time and where something might be going into a wrong direction. For that, you can use console log, which I already showed you. This is a built-in command which outputs information in this developer tools console. It's invisible to the users of your page unless they open the developer tools, then they can see it, and that's important to keep in mind. Everyone can see what you output here, not just you, but it doesn't show up on the page itself. And it allows you to log whatever you want, log whichever variable you want to log. And this can be really useful for getting a first look into certain things or values of your code. You can also have multiple console log statements to see how things change throughout your program execution. So to kind of output the flow of your application. But writing these console log statements can also be cumbersome. Especially if you have a more complex error to fix, you might need to throw a lot of console log statements into your code, change them, configure them correctly, and that can be annoying over time. So therefore, also leverage the debugging tools which are built into modern browsers. I recommend the Chrome debugging tools, which are really amazing, but Firefox also has debugging tools built in, for example. Same for Edge and so on. But in this course, I will go with Chrome and show you how to work with those. And last but not least, your IDE can also help you with debugging and with fixing errors. We'll have a look at all these things now in the next lectures. Now let's start with errors which you can typically avoid. For example, simple syntax errors. Let's say you simply forgot to close your array here. Now right away, the IDE yells at us basically. You see we got the red squiggly line here. I got a red mark here on the right in the scroll bar, and the file itself also turned red. Here on the left in the Explorer, it's now red. And this indicates that there is something wrong which the IDE detected right away. You can then always hover over the red squiggly lines to get a description of the problem, and here you see expression or comma expected. Now to be honest, that's not the best error message because it doesn't really describe the problem here, that a closing square bracket is missing. Nonetheless, you quickly see that something is wrong here, and trivial errors like this of course can be easily fixed because you should quickly see that, yeah, we got a missing square bracket here. Now that might sound dumb, but it's easy to mistype or to accidentally delete something, and therefore having a look at what your IDE tells you is really a great idea and something you should do. Now sometimes you also got errors which don't really show up here in the IDE. For example, if I try to call parse here like this is not a built-in function actually, and the IDE knows that it's not built into JavaScript, but maybe it's a function defined by us, maybe in another file. Therefore, the IDE here doesn't yell at me because it doesn't know whether I might have to find a function called parse in another file. For example, here I'm also calling output result, which is not defined in this file, and which also is not a default JavaScript function, but since I have it defined in vendor.js, this will work. So it would be bad if the IDE would complain about this line. It's the same here now. Now, of course, this is not built in though, but maybe I mistyped and therefore used this, or I had a function named parse in the past, I deleted it and forgot to update this code. So this is code which works in the IDE, but it will not work here. If I reload this page and I try to add, you see, no matter how hard I press my buttons, nothing happens here. In such a case, it's always a great idea to open the developer tools, and my recommendation would be that you do this in incognito mode so that no browser extensions you might have installed can interfere here, because they might also change something on the page or run some scripts which might show up in your developer tools even though they're not directly related to your code. So open the developer tools here under View, Developer, Developer Tools, or with the shortcut you see there. And there you should always go to the console first, because it's here where you'll find potential error messages. And indeed, here you see I got error messages regarding parse not being defined. Now that's the part I meant with reading the error messages. I could now go into panic mode because there's so much red here, but if we just have a look at the error message, it's pretty clear what the problem is. Parse is not defined, okay. And we even see where this was called. It was called in the getUserNumberInput function, which we find in app.js, and there, this is the line number 7. The error also is stemming from line number 7. And then, if that is not helpful to us, we see that it was called in getUserNumberInput, which in turn happened because this add event here on our button basically triggered. And that was set up in line number 33. Now we can even click here, and we're taken right to the source code here in the developer tools. So here under the sources tab, we now see the problematic source code. And since this is the code as it was executed by the browser, so at runtime, the browser knows that indeed here parse is not defined. The IDE can't know that because it doesn't know which scripts we might be loading, potentially from other servers and so on. But the browser totally knows what's available at this point of time, and it knows there is no built-in parse function, and there also is no code written by me or by some other third party which I added that would add a parse function. Therefore, the browser knows parse does not exist. And now we can have a look at our code and analyze what went wrong here. Did we expect to write a parse function on our own? Well, maybe we should do so now. Maybe we have a parse function, but it's called parse input and we therefore need to rename it. Or, as it's the case here, we're looking for the parse in function. So this is how we can narrow down the issue and fix it with the help of the error message we're getting. So we got syntax errors, which we can typically fix right in the IDE. Other runtime errors, which we can fix with the help of error messages by looking at them. Now let's have a look at logical errors, which are a bit harder to find. Let's say in my application here, when we add, then we're getting the user number input here, right? So that's triggering this function. And there, let's say we're not doing that int parsing. We're not converting this to a number. Of course, we're doing it here, but let's say we're not at this point yet. We forgot to add this code. That would be a typical logical error. Everything will work technically, but the app will not behave the way it should because we have a logical error in our code. Because now if I go back and I reload this page, and I go back to the console here, you see if I enter a 5 here, we got this output which we saw and fixed in the last course module, right? Where the text is kind of concatenated instead of being calculated as a number. Now, we got no error message here, so that's hard. So what can we do in such a case? Well, we can get started with some good old console log debugging. We know that the behavior is not correct when I click the plus button, so we could go to that add function here, which is the function getting triggered when we click the plus button. And there we could throw in a console log statement. Now, let's console log the entered number here. And let's maybe also console log the current result. And you can console log multiple values here in one and the same console log statement. You can also combine this with some text. For example, here I'll output input. And this will simply print this text next to these values here so that if you have multiple console log statements, you can find this quicker. Okay, so with that added, let's go back, let's reload here, enter 5, hit plus, we see input, then we see 5, and then we see 0. And this doesn't make it super obvious the way it's printed here, but we can see that 5 and 0 look different, right? Even though both should be numbers. The 0 is blue and looks more numberish, if you will. The 5 is black, just like the input text. So if you're really having a closer look here, you can already spot the problem, which of course is that 5 is treated as a string and 0 is treated as a number, and therefore, as you learned, this will be concatenated to a string instead of combined as a number or added as a number. But it's still a bit hard to spot it here, but you can get there with console log debugging. You can also have multiple console log statements in your code to understand the flow of your code. If you're not sure if something is executed in the right order, you could throw in multiple dummy console log statements to see if they are executed in the right order. Now, as I said, we can fix this error here with console log, but we might not be able to spot the problem just yet. In such a case, you can use the Chrome DevTools, and there go to the Sources tab, where you essentially find all the files Chrome loaded for displaying this web page. So here you find your HTML file, but then you basically find the same folder structure I have, because that's the folder structure that was loaded for this web page. And you can go into the scripts folder, and there you find the 2 scripts that make up this web page. And here we can go into the app.js file and find the exact same code I wrote here, because that is the code that was loaded by the browser. And now here, you can do something neat. You can place breakpoints. Now, what are breakpoints? Breakpoints allow you to tell the browser to stop code execution when a certain part in the code is reached. So for example, here we can go to the add function and place a breakpoint right here so that we stop code execution when we reach this line, so that we can then look into our code and its current state during execution. That's what we'll be able to do. Now, to place a breakpoint, you just need to click on the line number here and you see this mark. You can also place multiple breakpoints, by the way. Now, if you placed that, what will happen is that if you now run your code, in this case, when I add 10, you see now this gets frozen. You see this message here, paused in debugger. You can resume by clicking this play button, but let's not do that now. And here on the right, you see this line now gets highlighted in blue, which means this is where the code execution stopped. And now you can, for example, hover over things to see their current values. For example, since code execution always stops before this line where you placed the breakpoint is executed, you see that entered number is currently undefined. Makes sense, because as I mentioned, it stops before this is executed. So this is all undefined. Now you can step through your code with these controls down there. You can always resume, which means that it will continue running until it hits the next breakpoint if there is any. You can step over the next function call, which basically means you move to the next line. I'll show this later. You can also step into a function call. That would be nice here, because here we are calling a function, and by stepping into it, you see we now jump to that code which is executed in that function. And now here again, I can hover over this. Here, since user input refers to an element in my HTML page, I even get it highlighted on the left, which is another convenience feature. And here, since user input is a quite complex object, I can even find all the properties of this object and get the value that's in there, also by hovering over the value. And we see this is a string, 10. This might already allow us to fix this error at this point, but let's say we haven't fixed it yet. So we see that's a string, okay. We're now done. We can now step out of the current function, back to the code where we had our breakpoint, and we're now in the next line, and we now see entered number is that string. Now we're not interested in this line, so we can just go to the next line with step over next function call or this button. The difference is that this will always step over the next line, and if a function is executed there, it will not go into that function, but just call that function and go to the next line with the result of that function call available. This, on the other hand, will always go to the next step, and if that's inside of a function, it will go into that function. So it kind of combines this button and this button. And we can go through our code with these buttons, therefore. You also see I got this nice output shown by the developer tools here, which shows me the values of entered number and initial result even without hovering over them. And that, for example, should already allow us to kind of fix the problem here, because now we see this is a string, and this might allow us to see that that might be the problem with our addition, that we're working with a string here. If I go over this line, we see current result is this concatenated string, and now it should definitely be clear that the problem is that we're kind of working with strings here. This would probably allow us to fix the error. Now, before we fix it though, let me show you what else we got here in the debugging view. At the bottom, for example, I haven't really talked about that besides these buttons. You see your call stack. The call stack is essentially a list of all the functions that have been called. Let's say here we go into create and write output. If I do that, you see now this is on the call stack as well. And below that is the add function. You can also click here to jump between the lines that are connected. What this means is that the topmost thing is always the function which is currently running, and below that you find other functions that were responsible for calling that function. So that kind of shows you the order of your code execution, if you will. There you also see the variables that are available, local variables and global variables. There, by the way, we have a lot of dummy variables because in the browser we got a bunch of general information about the window available globally. But that's also something I'll dive in later. Local variables here would be the variables available in this function here, and that are essentially all the different parameters I'm getting and calc description. And we can ignore this thing here for now. So that can also be really nice that you see which variables are available there and which values they currently have. You can even change the values here. For example, here we could change this to a number and change initial result to a number to see whether this now executes correctly. And if it does, we would see that the problem is not our addition logic, but the logic where we get the input. So changing these values here is also something useful you can do. You can also set up a watcher here. There you can add an expression where you want to watch certain values. You can either just enter the value name, like entered number, and now you always see the value of this variable here as it changes throughout your function execution. But you can also add a more complex expression like entered number plus current result. And now you will always see the result of this as your code executes. So this can also be really nice for keeping track of how things change during your code execution. Now, needless to say that all of that is lost and cleared when you reload the page or when you're done with the function execution. So this is really just temporarily there in memory to help you debug your code. So that were normal breakpoints and how we use the debugger here. Now there also are other breakpoints, which I want to show you before we ultimately fix this error here. For example, you got conditional breakpoints. Let's say you have some error which you noticed only occurs if you enter numbers greater than 100 here. So let me resume this here. I cleared the breakpoint by just clicking on it again. And now, of course, our error here doesn't occur just for numbers greater than 100, but let's assume that would be the case. In such cases, if you right-click here, you can also add a conditional breakpoint, which allows you to write the expression like only pause here if get user number input is greater than 99. So now we would only pause here if a number greater than 99 is entered. So therefore here, if I enter 100, you now see this pauses here. On the other hand, if I resume and I enter 5 here, this doesn't pause. So conditional breakpoints can be nice, and also very nice if we increase this at the bottom again, are the event listener breakpoints. Now we know something goes wrong when we click the plus button. It also will go wrong on any other button though, so we might not be interested in manually adding breakpoints here to add and subtract and to multiply. Instead, we might be interested in just pausing the code whenever a click happens. And you can do that with the event listener breakpoints. There you can expand mouse and there click. If you click this, if you check this, now you will pause whenever a click occurs. For example, if I click here, now execution pauses in the first line of the function which is handling that click. And now we can navigate through that here. So now you see that pauses no matter where I click. Now important, it does not pause if I click anywhere else on the document, really only on event listeners I registered for click events. There it will pause. So let me clear this now because we don't need it anymore. We already found the error, but that's all important to be aware of. So now that we're able to find the error, let's fix it. And let's say we think we know what the problem is, but we're not sure yet. Of course, we can always go back to our code and change it here and reload the page and try it again. But you can also change your code here in the Sources tab. There we have the suspicion that fetching our user input is the problem, so that this is a string instead of a number. So we could add parse int here, like this, to see whether that does the trick. Now you just have to save this by pressing Command or Control Save, so that the star disappears up there. And you get a warning that this only was saved locally, so only here in the browser, not to your file system. So the code we have here still is untouched. If you go to get user number input here, you see that's untouched. So you don't change your local code, but you change it here in the browser so that you can test changes here in the browser without facing the danger of changing your real code and maybe breaking things there. So now if I add 5 again, now this is looking better because now you see this is not getting concatenated, but instead this really changes here at the end. It really adds 5 as a number. So now that we validated this fix, we can just take it and bring it to our real code and then apply it here, save, and now reload. And now we have the code we wrote, and now we see this is now really working the way it should. So this is how we can work with the debugging tools. Now you got more tabs up there. We'll explore them later in the course. For example, the Elements tab once we work more with the DOM. And the Performance and Memory tab, these are tabs I'll dive in later once we optimize performance and memory usage of our application. For now, the Sources tab, breakpoints, and the console here. These are your bread and butter tools for finding and fixing errors. Now, the Chrome developer tools are pretty amazing, and as you saw, you can do a lot there, and I personally prefer working with those, but you can actually also use your IDE to set breakpoints and so on. Now, for that here in Visual Studio Code, you just need to make sure that you got a special extension installed, and for that you can search for Chrome Debug, and you should find the debugger for a Chrome extension, which I have installed. If you haven't, make sure you do install it, because this will allow you to connect your Visual Studio Code editor to the Chrome debugging tools. So with that installed, let me go back to the Explorer view here. Let's say we have the same problem we had before. So we want to debug this here. And now we want to be able to run this code with the help of the Chrome debugger, but also connected to our editor here, so that we can set breakpoints here. And we can indeed set breakpoints here. Let's say we have the suspicion that something goes wrong when we click the add button and this function executes. Now you can set a breakpoint here by clicking on the left of the line number, and now we got the red dot here, which means this is a breakpoint. Now we just need to run this application, this website here, with the help of our editor. So instead of manually opening the browser and opening our index.html file in there, now we need to go to debug here and then start debugging. Now, the first time you click this, you might be asked in which environment to run, though this probably is only the case if you got other environments installed, so it might also just automatically pick Chrome if you don't have other environments. Otherwise, choose Chrome here. And now it adds such a launch JSON file in VS Code. This configures how it launches your application in the browser, because it will open up a new browser window. Now, here, this is generally okay, but this URL is wrong. This would be right if you had a local development server, which we don't have here, so that will not work for us here. I'll dive into local development servers later. For now, we should just copy and paste this URL, which we opened in the browser, and basically paste this in here, using the file protocol and then the path to your index.html file ultimately. With that, if you save that, the rest can stay as it is. You can now press debug, start debugging again. And what this will do is it will now launch the app here, enter this debugging view here, which you can always switch with view, go back to the Explorer, or go back to the debugging view, which we have here. And we can also go back to our code now, have the breakpoint set here, and go to that window which it opened, which in my case is this browser window. Now, if I now enter something here and I click plus, you see it goes back to the editor and pauses the code execution here. Now, just as in the Chrome development tools, here we also see which variables are available in this execution context, local and global variables. We can add watch expressions here, just as I showed it to you in the Chrome developer tools. We see the call stack, and we see it's getting paused here. We can hover over things to see their result. And we also get controls to step into a function, for example, and see the updated call stack, see values if we hover over them, and of course step out of them, resume execution, stop debugging and close the debugger with this red square, and so on. So you can essentially do the same as in the Chrome debugger, but now directly in your IDE, which you might or might not find more convenient. Now, as I said, personally like the Chrome debugging tools, also because some of the extra features we have here, that we can change the code without really changing the code, but that's up to you. If you like to use your local editor, this is how easy you can get started with Visual Studio Code. Now, you can always clear breakpoints here by just clicking on them again. So this is how you can leverage the IDE for that in case you prefer that. And once you stop debugging, by the way, which you do by pressing the red square here, this will automatically close the browser window which it opened for you. You can also start the app in non-debugging mode here if you prefer to do that, but you can also just double-click the index.html file in your Explorer or Finder as we did. One note about the console that opened down there. This debug console opened during debugging. It outputs log messages here, and you can also evaluate expressions in here at runtime to run some quick calculations or get the value of a certain variable. So whilst the debugging process is running, you can use that console here to see what's going on in your code. Now that's it for debugging and for writing efficient code. In this module, you learned a lot about how to use and utilize and configure your IDE, and make sure you really do explore the features you can use there so that you can write code efficiently. Make sure you do configure your IDE to suit your needs, both regarding its looks, but also regarding the way it works. You learned about MDN and what a great resource it is, and how to Google correctly and use Stack Overflow to find help. And you also learned about the Chrome debugging tools and how you can use your IDE for debugging to run your code, pause your code, find errors, and also, of course, make sure that the app works the way it should. These are crucial features as a developer. They're just as important to know as is the JavaScript language itself. So really make sure that these are things you feel comfortable working with, that you are comfortable working with the debugging tools. And with all of that, we are well prepared to now dive back into JavaScript, dive deeper into it, because now we don't just have the very basics about JavaScript down, but we also know how to write code, how to get help, how to debug and fix errors, and hence we can now dive deeper into JavaScript.